humans have shaped the world and been shaped by it over the past 2 million years. So, these 100 objects in the book are drawn from the British Museum's vast collection of objects. excavation took place was that there was no body in the grave, but Angus Wainwright has an explanation. People wondered whether this could be a cenotaph, a burial where the body had been lost, a sort of symbolic burial. But nowadays we think a body was buried in the grave, but because of the special acidic conditions of this soil, it just dissolved away. What you have to remember is that a ship is a watertight vessel, and when you put it in the ground, the water percolating through the soil builds up in it, and it basically forms an acid bath, in which all these organic things like the body and the leatherwork and the wood dissolve away, leaving nothing. The discovery of this ship burial captured the British public's imagination. It was hailed as the British Tutankhamun, but the politics of 1939 lent a disturbing dimension to the find. Not only did the excavation have to be hurried because of the approaching war, but the burial itself spoke of an earlier and successful invasion of England by a Germanic-speaking people. Angus Wainwright describes what they found. Very early on in the excavation, they discovered ship rivets, the iron rivets that hold together the planks of a ship. They also discovered that the wood that had made up the ship had rotted completely away, but by a rather mysterious process, the shape of the wood was preserved in a kind of crusted blackened sand. So by careful excavation, they gradually uncovered the whole ship. The ship is 27 metres long. It's the biggest, most complete Anglo Saxon ship ever found. Ships were very important to these people. The rivers and the sea were their means of communication. It was much easier to go by water than it was by land at this time, so that people in, say, modern Swindon would have been on the edge of the world to these people, whereas people in Denmark and Holland would have been close neighbours. We still don't know who the owner of the boat was, but the Sutton Hoo helmet put a face on an elusive past, a face that has ever since gazed sternly out from books, magazines and newspapers. It has become one of the iconic objects of Britain's history. It is the helmet of a hero, and when it was found, people were at once reminded of the great Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf. Until 1939, it had been taken for granted that Beowulf was essentially fantasy, set in an imaginary world of warrior splendour and great feasts. The Sutton Hoo grave ship, with its cauldrons, drinking horns and musical instruments, its highly wrought weapons and lavish skins and furs, and not least its sword of gold and silver, was evidence that Beowulf, far from being just a poetic invention, was a surprisingly accurate memory of a splendid, lost, pre-literate world. Look at the helmet, decorated with animal motifs, made out of gilded bronze and silver wire, and bearing the marks of battle. Then see what Beowulf has to say. To guard is generally supposed that the man buried with such style must have been a great warrior chieftain, because all of us want to link finds in the ground with names in the texts. For a long time, the favoured candidate was Raedwald, King of the East Angles, mentioned by the Venerable Bede in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and probably the most powerful king in all England around 620. But we can't be sure, and it's quite possible that we may be looking at one of Raedwald's successors, or indeed at a leader who's left no record at all. So the helmet still floats intriguingly in an uncertain realm on the margins of history and imagination. Seamus Heaney says, especially after 11th of September 2001, when the fireman was so involved in New York, the helmet attained new significance for me personally, because I had been given a fireman's helmet way back in the 1980s by a Boston fireman, which was heavy, which was classically made of leather with copper and a metal spine on it and so on. I was given this, and I had a great sense of receiving a ritual gift, not unlike the way Beowulf receives the gift from Hrothgar after he kills Grendel. In a sense, the whole Sutton Hoo burial ship is a great ritual gift, a spectacular assertion of wealth and power on behalf of two people, the man who was buried there and commanded huge respect, and the man who organised this lavish farewell and commanded huge resources. The Sutton Hoo grave ship brought the poetry of Beowulf. Unexpectedly close to historical fact. In the process, it profoundly changed our understanding of this whole chapter of British history. Long dismissed as the Dark Ages, this period, the centuries after the Romans withdrew, can now be seen as a time of high sophistication and extensive international contacts that linked East Anglia not just to Scandinavia and the Atlantic, but ultimately to the Eastern Mediterranean beyond. The very idea of ship burial is Scandinavian, and the Sutton Hoo ship was of a kind that easily crossed the North Sea, so making East Anglia an integral part of the world that included modern Denmark, Norway and Sweden. The helmet is, as you might expect, of Scandinavian design, but the ship also contained gold coins from France, Celtic hanging bowls from the west of Britain, imperial table silver from Byzantium, and garnets which may have come from India or Sri Lanka. And while ship burial is essentially pagan, two silver spoons clearly show contact, direct or indirect, with the Christian words, it says everything about our national identity, that the drink, which has become the worldwide caricature of Britishness, has nothing indigenous about it, but is the result of centuries of global trade and a complex imperial history. Beyond the modern British cup of tea lie the high politics of Victorian Britain, the stories of 19th century empire, of mass production and of mass consumption, the taming of an industrial working class, the reshaping of the agriculture of continents, the movement of millions of people and a worldwide shipping industry. By the middle of the 19th century in Britain, some luxuries came to be seen as not only desirable but essential. The most ubiquitous of all was tea, a vital ingredient of life for every part of the British population. The object that highlights this change is a tea set, made up of 3 pieces of red-brown stoneware, a smallish teapot about 14 centimetres or 6 inches high with a short straight spout, a sugar bowl and a milk jug. They were made, as we can read on their bases, at Wedgwood's Etruria factory in Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire, in the heart of the potteries. In the 18th century, Josiah Wedgwood had made some of the most expensive stoneware ceramics in jasper and basalt in Britain, but this tea set shows that by the 1840s, when Wedgwood produced it, the company was aiming at a much wider market. This is quite clearly mid-range pottery, simple earthenware of a sort that many quite modest British households were then able to afford. But the owners of this particular set must have had serious social aspirations, because all 3 pieces have been decorated with a drape of lacy hallmarked silver. The historian Selina Fox explains that tea time had become a very smart event. In the 1840s, the Duchess of Bedford introduces the ritual of afternoon tea, because by this time dinner had become so late, 7:30 to 8 o'clock, that it was a bit of a gap for the British tummy between lunchtime and evening. For a while there was a revival of tea drinking as a sort of meal for sandwiches and so forth around 4 o'clock. Among the upper classes, tea had been popular since before 1700. It received celebrity endorsement from Charles II's Queen, Catherine of Braganza, and from Queen Anne. It came from China. It was expensive, refreshingly bitter, and drunk in tiny cups without milk or sugar. People kept their tea in locked tea caddies, as if it were a drug. For those who could afford it, it often was. In the 1750s, Samuel Johnson confessed himself a happy addict, a hardened and shameless tea drinker who has for 20 years diluted his meals with only the infusion of this fascinating plant, whose kettle scarcely has time to cool, who with tea amuses the evening, with tea solaces the midnight, and with tea welcomes the morning. Desire for the drink increased in the 18th century, but government taxes kept the price high, so a vigorous smuggling trade developed to avoid the excise duty. By the 1770s, most of the tea entering Britain was smuggled. It was estimated that £7 million or 3 million kilograms of tea were illicitly trafficked into Britain. Against only £5 million or 2 million kilograms imported legally. In 1785, especially within Britain. Fortunes were made in shipping. The tea trade required huge numbers of fast clipper ships for the long voyage from the Far East, which docked in British harbours alongside vessels bringing sugar from the Caribbean. To get sugar onto a British tea table had until very recently involved at least as much violence as was needed to fill the teapot. The first African slaves in the Americas worked on sugar plantations, the start of the long and terrible triangular trade that carried European goods to Africa. African slaves to the Americas, and slave-produced sugar to Europe. After a long campaign involving many of the people who supported temperance movements, slavery in the British West Indies was abolished in 1833, but in the 1840s there was still a great deal of slave sugar around. Cuba was a massive producer, and it was of course cheaper than the sugar produced on free plantations. The ethics of sugar were complex and intensely political. The most peaceful part of the tea set is, not surprisingly, the milk jug, though it too is part of a huge social and economic transformation. Until the 1830s, for urban dwellers to have milk, cows had to live in the city, an aspect of 19th century life we're now barely aware of. Suburban railways changed all that. Thanks to them, the cows could leave town, as an 1853 article in the Journal of the Royal Agricultural Society of England makes clear. A new trade has been opened in Surrey since the completion of the South Western Railway. Several dairies of 20 to 30 cows are kept, and the milk is sent to the various stations of the South Western Railway and conveyed to the Waterloo terminus for the supply of the London market. So, our tea set is really a three-piece social history of 19th century Britain. It is also a lens through which historians such as Linda Coley can look at a large part of the history of the world. It does underline how much empire, consciously or not, eventually impacts on everybody in this country. If in the 19th century you are sitting at a mahogany table drinking tea with sugar, you are linked to virtually every continent on the globe. You're linked with the Royal Navy, which is guarding the sea routes between these continents. You are linked with this great tentacular capital machinery through which the British control so many parts of the world and ransack them for commodities, including commodities that can be consumed by the ordinary civilian at home. The next object comes from another tea-drinking island nation, Japan. But unlike Britain, Japan had done all it could to keep the rest of the world at bay and join the global economy only when forced to do so by the United States, literally at gunpoint. Well, let's see. Okay, so the next object is soccer size, the Great Wave woodblock print from Japan. Maybe we'll read that next time. Well, this is a